When we think of rockets, we think of America and Russia and their great space race.
But this is the almost forgotten story of Britain's very own rocket program.
It wasn't something that we'd got from the Americans, it was something that we'd done ourselves.
Britain's rocket men were unsung space pioneers at the cutting edge of technology.
You're generating much more power per unit volume than almost anything else on the planet.
Any error could spell disaster.
It was the biggest and the most epic explosion that's ever occurred at the range head.
We've tracked down the small British team who overcame daunting odds to realize their dream and put Britain into space.
In the 1950s, the world was waking up to the possibility of space travel. The Second World War had triggered all kinds of new technology, including some very big military rockets. Britain's scientists and engineers were front runners in dreaming up schemes that would adapt this new rocket technology to blast mankind towards the stars.
It wasn't just a technical challenge, it was what the future of the human race would be. There were thoughts that our view of the whole universe might change as a consequence.
Many of these visionary ideas came from members of the British Interplanetary Society.
The Interplanetary Society used to meet here at the Mason's Arms pub in London's Mayfair. These were no childish dreamers, but some of the best scientific brains in Britain. As early as 1938, they'd even sketched out detailed plans to put a British man on the moon.
John Scott was one such enthusiastic scientist who thought it was only natural that Britain should play its part in the international race into space.
There was a general feeling, looking around the world, particularly at the Americans and the Russians, we had every bit as good a chance as the others, provided we could get some backing to do it.
Unfortunately, the British government didn't share the scientists' enthusiasm for space travel.
Well, the government didn't have scientists and engineers in it. It didn't understand it, had other problems. So when proposals were made to the government, they tended to meet with a very lukewarm attitude.
All ministers cared about was using space rockets for military use. The 50s marked the start of the Cold War between Russia and the West. Britain's politicians asked the companies that had helped with World War II to develop nuclear missiles which could drop warheads on Moscow. But as the Americans had discovered, rocket science wasn't easy. Their early attempts often ended in disaster. Even their most successful rocket of the era, the Redstone, failed on 47 of its 100 launch attempts. In 1955, Britain began to build its first space rockets. The site the rocket men chose to test their new machines was a peaceful cliff top on the Isle of Wight. They built a state-of-the-art test facility overlooking the Needles. Electromechanics enthusiast Derek Mack was one of the team hired to design, build and launch Britain's first space rockets. He found himself working right at the cutting edge.
Technologies were fairly basic. The transistor had only just come on the scene. Digital systems were a pipe dream in the future. So we were at a pioneering stage of this sort of work.
Whilst the Americans and Russians had built rockets driven by a mixture of liquid oxygen and hydrogen, our pioneering British rocket men decided to take a chance on a very different fuel system, with a chemical that can be found in any hairdressing salon.
The scientists had been fascinated by this stuff, hydrogen peroxide, the source of the platinum blonde. It looks like water. In fact, it almost is H2O, except it has an extra O. It's H2O2. And believe me, that extra oxygen atom makes this into a super fuel.
The hairdresser's version is only 15% pure. The rocket men's was concentrated to 85%, far more powerful stuff.
Watch what happens when the hydrogen peroxide reacts with this catalyst. Look at that! It explodes into superheated steam.
It has wonderful properties. In fact, it's almost an engineer's dream.
By adding kerosene to the superheated steam and oxygen, our rocket men believed they had found the cheapest and simplest possible method to blast Britain's first rocket into space.
You're generating much more power per unit volume than almost anything else on the planet.
In 1958, after 3 years of development, the Brits headed to the vast open spaces of Australia to see if their innovative rocket would work.
That night, Britain's first space rocket had its cables released and was all set for the takeoff.
To the team's delight, their military test was a huge success, and many more perfect launches followed.
We had a vehicle that worked. It was simple, it was cheap. It wasn't something that we'd got from the Americans, it was something that we'd done ourselves.
Ultimately, 22 Black Knights tested here blasted off successfully from Woomera with only 3 failures, making it one of the most successful rockets of all time.
But despite this early triumph, the government abandoned their plans for a military rocket. The politicians decided to buy new American missile technology instead, and the British program was axed. It was devastating news. With no more money from the defence budget, it looked as if British rocket building was over. But the engineers and scientists were determined to keep their dream of space alive. They had to come up with a plan.
It fired us up to look for alternative applications and peaceful uses.
The rocket men hadn't forgotten the non-military space proposals of the British Interplanetary Society, and one of its most significant ideas had been dreamt up by a very famous member, the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke.
In a 1945 edition of the magazine Wireless World, Clarke had suggested the development of satellites stationed high in space to revolutionize international communications.
The Americans and Russians saw that Clarke's geostationary, hovering satellite idea could transform everything from telephone calls to television and navigation. They'd already begun to use their rockets as satellite launchers, but our heroes didn't see why this British idea should be left to the foreign superpowers.
We were proud to be British, and we wanted the government to produce a British satellite launching vehicle with a British-made satellite with the British-made experiments in it.
Out came the slide rules on the draftsman's pens, and proposals for a British satellite launching rocket began to take shape. It was a last-ditch attempt to save their rocket program, but the government wasn't keen.
Sadly, one of the ministers openly criticised all the proposals that were being made and said that they could see no case for a commercial, i.e. non-military, space system of any sort.
I don't think the Chancellor Exchequer thought about it at all. If he did, for 5 seconds, it was, sounds like a good idea, don't spend any money on it.
But the team weren't asking for much money. They already had their simple and hugely successful hydrogen peroxide-driven space rocket. They claimed they could adapt it for next to nothing.
They proposed to create a small space rocket, 13 meters high, and built in 3 disposable sections. The first stage would launch over 18 tons of rocket and fuel up to around 35 miles. Then the second stage would blast into action, roaring up to 365 miles. Finally, a small solid fuel motor would take over to propel the rocket's precious cargo, a satellite about as heavy as me, the last 20 miles into its permanent orbit above the Earth. And they called their cut-price satellite launcher Black Arrow.
In space terms, it was a trivial amount of money. The Black Arrow was really a way of getting into the satellite business on the cheap.
And it worked. Enough small change was found to get things going, and the British space rocket program was back in business with a tough new mission: to blast a satellite into orbit on a British rocket.
Satellite launching represents the ultimate challenge. And so there was great enthusiasm from every quarter. Everybody could get up and get going and get on with the job now.
But building this space rocket on the cheap was fraught with danger. The Americans already knew that failing to get things right had explosive consequences. But their billion-dollar programs could survive disasters. Britain's rocket men had a shoestring budget. If they suffered a similar catastrophe, it could kill their program altogether. By 1969, the Americans and Russians had spent billions of dollars on their space rockets. The Apollo astronauts were about to make their first trip to the moon. British hopes were pinned on Black Arrow, the low-budget satellite-launching rocket which was preparing for its very first test launch at Woomera in the Australian desert.
Area 6, launch officer. Go ahead, mate. Proceeding to launch area now.
On the 28th of June 1969, Derek Mack and his colleagues took their seats in the control room. This launch would be the first of just 3 planned test flights before Black Arrow would perform Britain's first satellite launch.
The preparation had been a long, drawn-out process, and so the launch was the culmination of all this effort. Here we were at last now for the first try to launch it.
The last-minute checks were complete. The countdown for this crucial first test launch was underway.
We're at item 255700, Bill.
I could only liken it to like a live stage show, I should imagine, where it had to be right on the night.
Ring 15, con 1.
At 8:28 a.m., everyone in the control room held their breath.
08, radiating prohibit.
Launch initiated.
Everything's in slow motion. You just see it hang there and slowly lift away, and these great shock diamonds are coming out of the jets, which is characteristic of that type of engine, and it slowly climbs away.
But seconds later, as he watched the data being beamed back from the rocket, Derek Mack realized that something had gone terribly wrong.
The carcass of the rocket was actually rolling backwards and forwards about its longitudinal axis. Instead of the 8 diamonds coming down together, you could see flickering going on one side. And you thought, jeeps, you know, what's happening out there?
Some of the launch crew ran outside to get a better view of the unfolding drama, and what they saw horrified them. Black Arrow was no longer climbing.
As it started to tumble, and the engines had stopped burning, and so I immediately thought, jeepers, you know, we want to get back in the equipment centre because she's coming down.
The rocket had turned upside down, and almost 16 tons of highly explosive rocket fuel was heading straight back at them.
We nearly got trampled on sort of going back into the equipment centre. Then we slammed the door shut.
To prevent an inferno on the launch pad, the range safety officer took a critical decision.
The whole ground lit up. It was the biggest and the most epic explosion that's ever occurred at the range head. When we went outside, there was all this sort of bits of debris floating around and coming down, and all the telegraph wires were festooned with what you could liken to Christmas decorations, in the sense they were fine filaments glistening, and essentially it was just molten and streamed aluminium, which was streamed out in long thin veins where it had all melted up there and got blown apart in a fairly high velocity explosion.
The cause of this enormous disaster was the failure of a single control circuit that made the rocket swing wildly out of control. One tiny copper wire had destroyed years of hard work.
I'd lived with this piece of hardware for a long, long time. I knew virtually every part of it personally. And to see it sort of totally destroyed in such a big way was a terrible blow.
Obviously, there was a sense of complete disappointment and devastation, which they had to wash away with countless amounts of beer for several days until they felt better.
It was the worst possible start. The failure of Black Arrow's first test launch was a miserable experience for the team, but far worse, it threatened to undermine the credibility of their entire satellite launching project.
It wasn't a disaster in a technical sense, it was a disaster in a political sense. It was potentially a killer. The whole program could die because it hadn't worked as advertised.
This very public failure was just the excuse civil servants here at the Treasury in London needed to get their knives out. Cuts had to be made, they said, and there were excesses on the balance sheet, like this hopeless satellite launcher that the country simply couldn't afford. Black Arrow and the future of the British space program hung in the balance as never before.
8 months after that calamitous first test, the team launched a second test rocket successfully. But then in September 1970, disaster struck once again. The third and final test rocket failed to reach the right altitude, and instead of putting its dummy satellite into orbit, it hurled it into the sea.
This time, the Treasury knives were sharpened and ready for action. A full inquiry was ordered into why it had all gone so terribly wrong. And when the cause was identified as a faulty valve starving the engines of fuel, there were calls for a total redesign. It was just the ammunition the Treasury needed to demand the program was shut down.
There was nobody with any power that was supporting us in either government, or in the civil service, or even in the aircraft industry.
Nowhere was there a high-level champion who saw this as important for the UK, important for its technology, and important for waving the flag and showing that we were capable of doing it.
But Black Arrow's test program was now complete, and the team believed they'd solved their technical problems. In July 1971, Black Arrow was ready to carry out its ultimate mission, the UK's first ever satellite launch. But then, the unthinkable finally happened.
On the 29th of July, just as the final Black Arrow was already on its way to the launch pad in Australia, Britain's Minister for Aerospace, Frederick Caulfield, got to his feet in the House of Commons and made the announcement the rocket men had been dreading. It was all over. The Black Arrow was cancelled.
That might have been the end of Britain's journey into space, but our rocket men weren't giving up. The final Black Arrow had safely arrived in the Australian desert, along with the satellite it was built to launch, called Prospero. And there was just enough money left over to light the blue touch paper.
They had a beast out in Woomera ready to go. The thing was cancelled, and they said, "We didn't hear that, we're going to fire the damn thing."
Everyone took their old places in the control room for Black Arrow's final countdown. The team was still hoping that the politicians' minds could be changed.
This launch mattered to me because it had been cancelled, this programme. And the one way to really show them what we could do and were capable of was to have a successful launch and place a satellite into orbit. And we were dead intent on doing that.
At 1:39 p.m. on Thursday, the 28th of October, 1971, Black Arrow faced its ultimate challenge.
She was lifting slowly away. I looked back at the telemetry system and everything seemed to work perfectly. It all flew away straight and serenely. It was just copybook.
Technical data coming back from the rocket told them that each stage had worked perfectly. But it couldn't tell them whether the satellite had been successfully deployed.
Second stage separation.
All the men could do
Confirmed.
was wait.
We knew there was a third stage firing. Was it pointing in the right direction? Had it spun up? All the rest of it we didn't know.
Across the world, listening stations were tuned in, hoping to pick up a signal from the new British satellite.
39 minutes later, the bleeps were picked up in Fairbanks, Alaska. Prospero was in orbit. Black Arrow had successfully performed Britain's first ever satellite launch.
There was just great carnival going on. And everybody had thick heads the next morning. But of course, realisation started to settle in. That was the end of it.
Despite the best efforts of the politicians, it was a tremendous achievement.
Look at this. Look at the accuracy with which we could do something. Why on earth are they sending all of us to the tip? Why can't they use our experience? Why can't they use us?
Having demonstrated our bit and kept faith, if you wish, we could not at all understand how it came to be cancelled. And nobody's ever explained that unsatisfactorily.
I suppose there was a lurk in the back of your mind that maybe somebody would have the willpower to sort of come out and say, well, look, you know, give them another chance. But it never happened, of course, did it?
The politicians never did change their minds.
Instead of our backroom heroes getting a pat on the back and a fat cheque, the man from the ministry came down to the test site here on the Isle of Wight, locked the gates, and shut off once and for all any British dream of rocketing into space.
Because we got out of the business, the French took leadership within the space business within Europe. We might have had still a European programme, but it would have been a British-led European programme, not a French-led European programme.
But to this day, every 100 minutes, 385 miles above our heads, a very special satellite still flashes across the sky.
Prospero's days of active service may be over, but it remains as a lasting testament to the determination of those who dreamed of putting Britain into space.
There are now 70 million mobile phones in the UK, more than one for every person. It's hard to imagine life without them.
No, I don't think any of us envisaged how big the revolution would become.
So how was this multi-billion-pound industry born? And who were the people who made it happen?
I remember phoning my mother, and she was completely flabbergasted that I could be driving around London and calling her from a car.
This is the story of how a few men in a cramped office behind a curry house took on the might of British Telecom and won the race to set up Britain's first ever mobile phone network. We've tracked down the underdogs in the great telecommunications battle of the 1980s.
A small team of engineers who overcame all the odds and revolutionized the way we communicate, changing our lives forever.
(1982), and making a call when you were out and about wasn't as easy as it is today.
If you're on the move all day, keeping in touch can be quite a problem. What do you do when your office is wherever you are that day?
The internet, text messages and Blackberries were all things of the future. And telecommunications were controlled by one giant company, the big and bureaucratic British Telecom.
In those days, you could have a telephone as long as it was black, and you waited 3 months for it. And BT controlled that totally.
But this was all about to change.
The technology now existed to make a mobile phone call, and the Thatcher government, always keen on progress, wanted to deliver this pioneering form of communication to the great British public. But there was a problem. The technology to build a mobile phone network was yet to be proved. So, whoever got the contract from the government to build this network would have their work cut out.
No one questioned that the mighty BT would be the obvious choice for the job. And as expected, in 1982, the government awarded the state-owned giant a license to build a new mobile phone network. But the Tories loved competition and hated the idea of BT resting on its laurels.
The choice that was available to government is, do we give the monopoly to BT? We knew they'd love it, but we knew they'd be very slow. So in order to inject some vitality into this market, we decided there should be two people running against each other.
The government decided to offer a second license and allow private companies to tender for it. Now anyone could pitch for the right to build a mobile phone network to rival BT's, if they had the guts to take on the mighty corporation.
So attractive was the lure of this second contract that virtually every electronics company wanted to bid for the license to take on BT.
One of those companies bidding for the second network license was Racal. This was an electronics business that specialized in making military radios and knew nothing about telephones. For Racal engineers like Dave Target, designing a mobile phone network was a world away from his everyday job.
I've been designing radio technology for about 5 or 6 years. Cellular was something completely new to all of us.
Fellow Racal engineer Mike Pinches was also more at home tinkering with a two-way radio than constructing an international telecommunications network.
The last piece of equipment that I was involved in leading the design of was a fairly large box that came in a khaki colour with rather robust knobs all over the front and sold for around about £6,000 a time for a soldier to use and carry on his back.
But the virtually unheard of Racal had one thing going in its favour.
Racal was a very different beast from BT. Tiny by comparison, but it was a company used to cutthroat competition and customer satisfaction. Exactly the type of thrusting capitalist business that the new Thatcher government liked.
Racal was very much a can-do company. Decision-making was quick. It was a question of getting things done with minimum bureaucracy.
It was this competitive edge that made Racal attractive to the Tories, even though it knew so little about telephones. In one of the biggest coups in telecommunications history, Racal beat off dozens of other companies and scooped the second license to build the mobile network and take on BT.
From that moment, the mobile race was on. Both companies had until March 1985 to launch their networks across Britain. BT had a pool of thousands of telephone engineers to call upon. Racal had just a handful of young engineers at their tiny office behind this curry house here in Newbury.
It was December 1982. The Racal team left the DTI with their hard-fought-for license. They now had just 2 years to build a network that could sustain thousands of callers. From day one, the outsiders had a lot to prove.
If you remember the old analogy that in big business, no computer manager ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, we anticipated a similar challenge, that when it came to selling mobile phones to businesses, they would naturally gravitate to BT as the safe choice.
Faced with BT's marketing clout, Racal decided there was only one way to impress the public, and that was to launch their network, which they named Vodafone, before BT launched its network, Cellnet.
It was very clear to us that our credibility would be helped no end if we could launch ahead of British Telecom.
It was absolutely vital we got there first. I think we needed to be the first company to launch a network.
It was a David and Goliath contest. The tiny Racal team versus the might of British Telecom.
We really didn't know what a mobile phone network looked like. We started to look at the literature. A lot of the original work was done in the States. They published a big journal in 1979, and that was our Bible of trying to understand all aspects of trying to design a mobile phone network.
The sense of excitement initially got overtaken very quickly by a sense of daunting challenges. I mean, we had a lot to do.
The first major obstacle our boffins faced was this: how to create a network that could serve millions of callers simultaneously. It seemed an impossible task.
It's very easy to give a high-quality service to one customer. Once you've got a lot of customers and you're beginning to see overload, it gets much more difficult.
Cracking this problem of capacity would prove crucial to the great mobile phone race.
That was the constant battle. As you got more and more customers, more and more telephone calls being made, to handle that increasing capacity without losing the quality that everybody was looking for.
To understand the problem our heroes faced, you must first understand how your mobile phone works.
Your mobile phone works like a walkie-talkie. It transmits your call to an aerial. which in turn is plugged into the phone network. These aerials are called base stations, and the zone each base station serves is called a cell. The problem Rakel had to solve was this: each base station could only cope with a few calls at any one time. If any more than around 40 callers dialed from within the same cell, the base station would become jammed.
If it was a large rural area, the chances of 20 farmers wishing to talk at the same time would be very low. So you could have quite a large cell covering a rural part of Britain. But once you got into a city, the chances of 20 people wanting to talk at once become much greater.
The great breakthrough was to switch from using a few powerful transmitters that each served cells the size of a city, and instead use dozens of weaker transmitters that served cells that were sometimes only a few hundred yards across. This created a web of cells, each on a different frequency from its neighbor. And ultimately, it allowed millions to dial up at the same time without overloading any one base station. This concept became known as a cellular system.
That concept changed everything in terms of saying you could now have a network that many, many people could use rather than just a few.
By July 1983, just 6 months into the race, Rakel had mastered cellular technology and cracked the problem of capacity. But unfortunately, so had their rivals at BT. And to make matters worse, when it came to building their cellular network, BT had an enormous advantage.
They owned a tremendous amount of property around the UK. So while Rakel had to identify sites for their base stations and then haggle with landlords to obtain them, BT simply found the local telephone exchange and built their base stations on the roof.
It seemed the mighty BT were way ahead of Rakel.
We had no existing portfolio of buildings. BT had something like 11,000 buildings around the UK.
And particularly in town centres, BT usually had a telephone exchange somewhere that they could easily give themselves permission to put another mast on it.
BT was storming ahead, leaving Rakel and its Vodafone network in their wake. To survive, our heroes would have to find a way to fight back. And they were about to come up with an ingenious solution that would swing the race back in their favour.
In the early 1980s, the greatest prize in telecommunications was the great mobile phone race. On the one hand, that great Goliath of a company, British Telecom, still state-owned, employing thousands of telephone engineers and having a monopoly, around 99% of all the phone calls in the UK. And on the other, Rakel, a military radio specialist, who were about to give a small team of backroom heroes the biggest challenge of their lives.
By January 1984, both BT and Rakel had been working on their mobile phone networks for a year. BT seemed to have an unassailable lead.
Oh, it's an absolute imperative to beat them in service. We were not going to be second, there's no question about it.
There were only 15 months remaining before the teams were due to launch. The boys at Rakel had to think of a way to fight back, and fast.
It was critical to the long-term success of the company to build the network as fast as we could.
Rakel engineers Mike Pinches and Dave Target had overcome the problem of capacity. Now they faced an even bigger challenge.
The one thing our heroes wanted to avoid was this: bad reception. It was bad enough if you couldn't get your favourite quiz programme on the radio because it was a poor signal from the transmitter. But if you'd paid good money for a mobile phone and you got a bad signal, then you'd want to change companies.
So what was the problem our heroes had to solve in order to build a network that offered good reception? Well, the key was all to do with the position of their transmitters, or base stations. The Rakel boys had to make sure every square inch of their network was within radio range of a transmitter. But this was far easier said than done.
If you could imagine a radio signal being transmitted across the landscape of the UK, everything that it hits affects it. So every tree, every hill, every building affects it in some way.
Radio waves love radiating off the top of hills. They don't go through them. And they also don't do very well through wet trees.
To try to model that was the great challenge.
Being able to map the chaotic way these signals travel between phones and transmitters would be critical in identifying the best locations for their transmitters. The team's ingenious solution to this problem was about to put them back in the lead in the race against BT. The secret weapon they came up with was a powerful computer program. It could analyze the way mobile phone signals travel across different types of landscape: hills, forests, fields, and buildings. Armed with this information, they hoped to be able to draw up a map of the best sites for their transmitters, creating a network with outstanding coverage. To start off, the team selected a location for a test transmitter just outside Guildford. They punched its coordinates into their computer, entered data about the surrounding terrain, and set the computer running. And this is what all that work produced. It's a bit of mobile history. This rather odd plot, this blue area here, is the predicted coverage of one of the very first Vodafone base stations. And they put that over the map of the south of England here with the coordinates precisely right. There's the town of Guildford there, and you can see from the hill that they're planning to put the transmitter on that there's very good coverage all the way around here. All this blue area means it's clear, but here, just right up, very close to the transmitter, very obstructive. So what they did was they asked the computer to see what would happen if they put the transmitter on a hill next door to that, a little bit further away to the east, so that the town of Guildford was over to the west. And now you can see the coverage from this other hill is much, much clearer. Good coverage all the way around the transmitter. At first glance, the computer seemed to work perfectly, but it had only proved itself on paper. How would it work in the real world? To find out, in early 1984, they took to the road.
We took a decision to construct a mobile test van full of equipment that would allow us to record and measure and log and analyse what the differences were between what we'd planned should be happening with our radio coverage and what we actually went and measured.
For 3 days, the Rakel boys drove along the roads surrounding their transmitter in Guildford, testing for reception and double-checking their computer's predicted area of coverage. To their great relief, the results they collected tallied perfectly with the computer's predictions, proving their revolutionary computer program worked in the real world.
And so that helped give us confidence that, we were going to be able to do what we'd said we'd do in the timescale.
Over the next 6 months, our heroes used their ingenious computer to build up a map of the best locations for their transmitters around the UK. By July 1984, both Rakel and BT were well into constructing their rival networks.
We were testing the network. We were aware that BT were testing theirs as well. So we were trying very hard to make sure we were going to be first.
But while the Rakel boys were now using their sophisticated computer to select the best locations for their transmitters, BT were placing their transmitters mainly on the buildings they already owned. And what had originally seemed a huge advantage to BT was now proving not to be.
They tended to put their cell sites in places that they already had. OK, that was easier for them to do, but it wasn't necessarily the best thing to do. We were trying to put the cell sites where they really wanted to be.
To some extent, I think the fact that we had to go out and find the best locations for our base stations meant that we ended up with a better quality network.
Pinchers and Target now knew they had the blueprint to build a better network than BT.
And better still, the small Rakel team were now more than on course to hit the deadline of March 1985. They hatched a bold plan to wrong-foot their rivals.
The earliest date we were allowed to launch was January the 1st. And so we had this kind of secret ambition that if we possibly could, we would try and do that.
But Rakel's secret plan to launch early meant the team now only had a few weeks to test their network. And yet they still had no idea if their system would work under the strain of thousands of calls. The only way to find out was to conduct a full dress rehearsal spanning the whole of Greater London. The team set up a temporary headquarters in the Royal Lancaster Hotel in the heart of the capital. From here, they hit the streets along with an army of volunteers, and they set about bombarding their network with calls. Their question was, would the network crash under the strain?
It was this test in those streets down below that would determine whether they really had a network they could launch.
It was the start of a tense week.
Each morning we'd go out with a plan of where we were each going to drive, a rough plan of which calls we were trying to make, different parts of the UK, because we were checking that we could call anywhere.
Back at their headquarters, every successful call was registered with a red circle, and every failure, a black mark.
Each night we would come back, analyse the results. We might change a few things overnight to improve it and go out and do the same thing the next day. I remember making some of the very early calls, phoning my mother, and she was completely flabbergasted that I could be driving around London and calling her from a car. She just couldn't cope with that. It just seemed impossible to her.
I still remember at the end of the first day when, frankly, I was reasonably happy with what I'd experienced in the car I was in, but had no real idea what everyone else was going to say. And getting back to the hotel that evening after the first day of the trials, to find a pretty strong level of general euphoria that we really had got something here we could sell.
As the week progressed, a positive pattern began to emerge, and the team realized they'd achieved something quite incredible.
At the end of the week, we'd done lots and lots of calls, many markers on the map, and we were very pleased that most of them were read, most of the calls were successful.
It's very satisfying when something you've worked pretty hard to achieve for 2 years begins to look like it's coming good.
On the edges, there were some black ones where we were running out of coverage, but generally it looked good. The network seemed to be working very well, and it was probably ready to be launched on an unsuspecting public.
The Rakel team had tested their Vodafone network to the limit. Now, all they could do was cross their fingers and hope their system performed on launch day. 2 years of blood, sweat and tears all came down to one phone call.
Here at London St Catherine's Dock is where the first official call was made on the new Vodafone network. Comedian Ernie Wise tapped in the number of that office behind the Curry House in Newbury, waited for an answer, and got one.
As Ernie Wise dialed his way into the history books, our heroes knew they'd pulled off the impossible. Through grit and determination, they'd beaten the mighty BT and launched Vodafone.
They were successful because they were in competition with BT. And they realised they had to run very hard. And when you've got two people running very hard, you've got a race.
I'm enormously proud of having played a role in the start-up of the company. I'm almost mind-boggled by the magnitude of what's turned out.
At the time, we really didn't realise at all what it was going to become. And certainly looking back now, it's very satisfying to realise that we were in at the beginning and we were creating something that was going to become such a success.
Rakel had launched their network 9 days before BT. And they had created a system that offered the superior service the British public were after. Within 9 months, Vodafone overtook Cellnet as the UK's #1 mobile phone network, and it never looked back.
That modest office behind the Curry House turned into this. Our heroes laid the foundations for what would become the largest mobile network in the world.